Welcome to Embracing Autism IRL. Today, we're thrilled to have Lee Burdette Williams, the Executive Director of the College Autism Network, as our guest. Lee brings a wealth of experience to the table, having spent years as a student affairs professional before stepping into her current role in 2019. She previously served as Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, as well as Dean of Students at the University of Connecticut. Lee is a passionate advocate and sought-after speaker, sharing her experience on student mental health, neurodiversity, and campus culture. We're excited to dive into her insights today. Welcome, Lee.
Thanks, Leah. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to ask you, for people who are not familiar with you or maybe are not familiar with the College Autism Network, can you briefly share a little bit about your journey into student affairs and working with neurodiverse students and what the College Autism Network is?
Yeah, so I have had a pretty traditional student affairs career, sort of starting out in, working in student activities and orientation. And then gradually, I worked my way up to being in a senior leadership role. And in that role, especially when I was at Wheaton College, which is a small liberal arts college, I was seeing more students every year come to campus, enroll on campus, who were really struggling socially and academically. And our director of disabilities would talk to me about them and say, well, this is somebody who's got a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And I just felt like I didn't know nearly what I needed to know. And I had learned some from my time at University of Connecticut, because they do this really, really well there. And so I had learned from my colleagues there. But I felt like I just don't know enough to really support these students. And I see this one-person disability services office really overmatched by the number of disabled students that she was supporting. So I started to look for opportunities for my staff and myself to get more familiar with and better educated about supporting autistic students. And then I started to kind of do that for other campuses, like talk to them about their autistic students. And that eventually led to me leaving that job and kind of getting connected to the College Autism Network, which was founded in 2016 by Brad Cox. He was a professor of higher education at Florida State. His son had been diagnosed with autism. And so, like a lot of parents, Brad kind of went on the offensive to figure out everything he needed to learn to help his son succeed. And being a college professor, Brad was already thinking about his 6-year-old son going to college. And so that led him to start CAN. And then he and I got connected through a mutual friend, and I started doing more of the training and outreach for CAN. And Brad is really focused on the research. And so things evolved over several years, and we ended up with a lot of people across the country who wanted to be part of a network, and they wanted to learn from one another. And so we hosted an annual event called, it wasn't annual at the time, it was like a one-shot deal in 2017 called the College Autism Summit. And about 70 people showed up, and they were so excited to meet other people who knew what they did on their campuses, right? Because when you are the person who's supporting autistic students, sometimes you're just like an army of one, and you feel really isolated on your campus. And so they really found their tribe at the summit and asked us to do it again the following year. And that was 8 years ago. So we're in the process of planning our 9th. And then in between those summits, people wanted to stay connected. And that's what started us on this journey to create a membership association. And we have about 800 or 900 members now, all of whom have some role in their job. Sometimes it's 100% of their work. Sometimes it's 20% of their work, but they work with and support autistic college students. And so what CAN does is kind of weave this thread of community across the country into Canada. We have some members in Europe, and the members learn from one another how to do this work. So I sort of stumbled into it and then found my footing, and have really felt like it's just the perfect place for me to spend my time.
Wow. I think that you guys basically started this organization right after I was starting college. It wasn't really a thing yet. I wish it was around when I was there because I feel like that's something I could have like leaned on.
Yeah.
I definitely can relate with like, there needing to be kind of different perspective when it comes to like college readiness, when it comes to autism in particular. I know like my experience was very different than I anticipated it would be. So I was wondering from like your perspective and from the perspective of CAN, I guess, like what is it that you guys consider to be college readiness for autistic individuals, and how would that differ from allistic or non-autistic people?
Mhm. Well, there are a lot of shared traits in college readiness between a neurotypical and a neurodivergent population, and um, so in my role as dean of students, I was often the one interacting with students and their families who were in trouble in some way, either student conduct or academic or social or mental health challenges. And only a slice of those would you say were neurodivergent. So I saw a lot of students struggle for a variety of different reasons. And so I see some of the similarities. It is hard. It is a big transition from high school to college. And it's gotten even more dicey post-COVID because students have really missed out on some of the social learning that really needs to happen in high school when they are interacting every day in person with their peers. So, when you think about a student graduates, any student graduates high school in June, and then July, August, 2 months later, they're kind of thrown right out of the nest, and so for a lot of them, they're experiencing independence and autonomy for the first time. They don't have their parents there as a safety net. They go from a very structured environment in high school where classes are, 7:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock, to having lots of free time in college because of the way classes are scheduled. They have their first exposure, for some of them, to sex, romance, alcohol, other substances. And, so when you think about the agenda for a first-year college student, it's really hefty. And so many of them are not ready for it. And that is true of neurodivergent and neurotypical students. I think what we have seen with autistic students is they tend to need more runway. They need more time to adjust. So the traditional way that we orient students is maybe there's like a 2-day orientation session during the summer that they come to. And then maybe they get there a few days before the upper class students, and they go through, a bunch of like talking head lectures and activities, and then that's it. And that's really hard. So when you think about autistic students needing this longer runway, they should be on campus in July and have like a month to just settle their nervous systems, to get more familiar with the environment, to build some confidence in their ability to, get from their dorm to their classroom. And when they don't have that confidence, when they're anxious, we know that the anxious brain is not effective for learning, right? So now they're starting classes, and for autistic students, there's always sort of low thrum of anxiety. It's always there. And so we're asking them to do something that for them is really challenging. So that readiness piece is about having the runway. It's also about really understanding what is going to be required of them in college, that they are going to have to get themselves up in the morning and get to class on time, and they're going to have to advocate for themselves when they miss an assignment or they don't understand something, and they're going to have to engage socially in ways that might not feel very comfortable for them. So if in their high school setting, those speed bumps have been smoothed a bit through the modifications that high schools make, they're gonna hit those speed bumps flying when they get to college, because colleges don't make modifications, right? They make accommodations. It's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
And the parents are like, wait, what do you mean you don't have a one-on-one aid for my student in the classroom? Yeah, no, we don't do that. And a lot of colleges, when they're pitching themselves as a place to enroll, when they are recruiting students, they will say things like, we'll do whatever it takes for your student to be successful. And parents are like, great, I know what that looks like. They get to college and it doesn't look like that at all. And so that's really hard. So kind of understanding what the landscape looks like and the expectations that will be put in place. And the last thing that I'll say is, so we've done this survey of autism-specific program directors. So some campuses have these programs for autistic students, and the students enroll at the college, but they also join this program, and it might be social or academic or both. And we surveyed the people who direct those programs, and there's about 140 of those across the country. And we said, what are the predictors that most stand out for you, that you think when you see a student, you're like, that student's going to be okay? And so what the survey showed was the program directors feel like the most important thing is that the student has to want to be in the program and willing to accept the help that's available. And if those two things are true, then the rest can be learned, right? And they see a lot of students who join a program because their parents have insisted that they do it, and they don't have any interest in doing it. And so that's like a big red flag.
Yeah. There's something that you mentioned earlier about like kind of the transition from high school to college. I know that like with autism, like transitions is a big challenge. And I know like for me, my biggest transition challenge was actually from middle school to high school. That was really hard for me. And then I graduated high school early to go to college early. And I couldn't get out of high school fast enough. So I was ready for it because I did not like high school. But what I find interesting though is that like in my experience in college, it was that first, like what you were saying, it's like an initial culture shock because everything is so different. And to the autistic mind, it's like you kind of have the script that you learn, and then the script is totally new. It's totally different. It's like what you had doesn't work and doesn't apply here. So how do colleges, or how can colleges kind of help an autistic person create the new script? Like, is there something in place or something that's recommended or suggested to help autistic people with that transition?
Yeah, and that's just the key question, right? A student once said to me, I feel like everybody got the script but me. Like they felt so kind of isolated and alone because they felt like everybody around them sort of knew what to do, and they were just kind of baffled by it. And they were used to having some prompts and some storyboarding, from how they had been raised, and those things weren't there. It is really hard, and so one thing that I strongly advise parents to do, and sometimes the students are like, "Yeah, nope, not doing that," is what I call the half-step year, and it is part of extending that runway, right, and making this transition a little more manageable. So instead of throwing at a student all of these like crazy, complicated, hard things. Like you're going to live someplace you've never lived before. You're going to have a roommate when you've never shared a room before. You're going to have to take 15 or 16 credit hours. And that's like 4 or 5 classes. And you're going to be totally responsible for making sure your assignments get done. And you're going to have to go to the dining hall and eat food that's really unfamiliar. And they're not going to care that you don't like certain things. Like they're just going to put it in front of you. So you're like throwing one thing after another, and you can kind of picture these students like just like trying to like catch things like, whoa. So the half step year is live at home, take 2 classes at a community college, take responsibility for refilling and taking your medication on your own, no help from your parents. Learn to go to office hours and talk to your professor. Learn to organize your semester academic assignments. And like, so a lot of sort of the basic executive function stuff, but that all college students have to learn. But they're not all operating with that low thrum of anxiety that autistic students have. So if you live at home with your folks, at least that is familiar. And so you don't have that sort of the insanity of a residence hall. And the parents are this safety net, right? Because parents are really good at saying, I think he has stopped taking his meds. And they know that like instantly, right? Parents are so tuned in. I can tell you that your RA or your hall director, they are not going to know that you've stopped taking the medication that you need to stay focused or, to ward off the chronic depression that you struggle with. But your parents do. So the half step year kind of allows you to practice a number of those skills and build the kind of confidence that I think is necessary. And, the family should have these benchmarks, right? Like, okay, let's see how you do 2 classes this semester. And if you can pass those classes and get yourself up in the morning, then we will talk about, you going to the 4-year school that is your dream. But I'm not going to write a check for $20,000 to pay, your tuition and take out loans that I'm going to have to pay back until we're sure that you have a pretty good chance of this. So that's, to me, like stretching out that runway and giving them the opportunity to practice those skills. Because it's devastating when a student crashes and burns and goes home.
Yeah, that was me. No, well, initially. But actually, it's interesting what you're saying, because that's almost like exactly what happened to me. And we naturally kind of figured that out. So like my first semester, I went in with a fully loaded course load, new place, new everything. And I was super stressed. I did stay home and commuted. So that helped. But what I realized was that, college was way more challenging than I had anticipated, because I thought high school was really easy. So I thought college would be the same, and it wasn't. And exactly what you're saying, I stayed home, I commuted. And then what we did is we pulled me out. I took a leave of absence after that first semester, and I took college courses, the gen eds at the local community college, to kind of get my bearings and kind of ground myself. And then you also kind of like regain your confidence. And so I did well there, and I felt like, okay, I'm a little bit more comfortable now trying again. Then when I went back in, I eased myself in with a little bit like the same classes, but a little bit less. So less of a course load, and then transitioned in. But I feel like a lot of times, I mean, autistic or not, college students don't often know this information in advance. Like people just, you're expected to go in with a full course load. You think that it's going to be like high school. And for autistic kids who have not just like the anxiety of transition, but a lot of autistic individuals also struggle with that kind of perfectionism and like that performance anxiety too. So I feel like sometimes it's even harder on autistic people because they don't meet the standard that they're used to meeting, and they don't quite understand why. Have you seen that at all with any of your students?
Oh, yeah. So So one of the things that I did to kind of make this transition from being a dean of students to working with this population is I went to work for this organization called Mansfield Hall. And it's an academic and residential support program for college students and it started in Burlington, Vermont. And that's so I moved there to take this job as director of student life. And I said, I don't really know much about autism or learning disabilities. And they said, well, that's okay. We don't know much about what deans of students do. So maybe you could help us, because their students attended the colleges in Burlington. So Champlain College and University of Vermont and St. Mike's and Community College of Vermont. And they really needed somebody who kind of understood how to talk to the people on those campuses. And I spent 2 years in this role, and it was sort of an apprenticeship working with these students. And about 2/3 of the students at Mansfield Hall have a diagnosis of autism. And so I learned a lot about this idea of like, you know, perfect is the enemy of done. It's one of the things that we would say, like, you know, or just the challenge that some autistic people have with kind of perspective and proportion. Like you are obsessing about this homework that's worth 2% of your grade, and you have a midterm next week that's worth 40% of your grade, and you won't even talk to me about the midterm because you're so obsessed about the homework, and you're going to fail this class, right? And so for me, not having a lot of experience with autism, not being autistic myself, I was like, why? What are you missing here? Like, why can't you see this? But my colleagues were really absolutely brilliant and taught me a lot about, you know, like how the autistic brain works. And this makes perfect sense. And so, you know, what I've kind of been able to do is just have a better appreciation for how hard the work is that our members do when they are working with these students who, you know, sometimes just lose sight of the big picture. You know, they definitely cannot see the forest for the trees, or they have a really disproportionate reaction to something. So, you know, they get a C on a homework assignment, which is worth, you know, 2% of their grade, and they really lose it. Like they're unspooled by it. And I'm like, well, it's okay. It's only 2% of your grade. Let's focus on the midterm. And you know, I think that's really what's like critical, is just understanding that the autistic brain is just wired really differently. And
yeah,
everything that my students did or all the challenges that they had made perfect sense to them. And so the most important thing that I learned was always to ask, like, what's going on here? You know, why are you so worried about this homework assignment? Well, my professor said that we have to be able to do the homework assignments to really do well in the exam. And if I can't, you know, oh, okay, yeah. I get this now. And, you know, and that's just, you know, what I would hear and learn from students that, you know, is when I work with college campuses, you know, and when I'm consulting or advising or doing a training for faculty, I just have to say, like, this is a hardwired brain-based difference, autism. Like, these aren't moral choices that students are making, and we often treat them like they are, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, what's wrong with you?
So the audience, I guess the target audience of who you speak to are professionals in the college. That's what the college network is, right? It's like the professionals working in the colleges, right?
Right. Yeah. So we support those professionals on campus. But we also, you know, provide resources for parents. I get probably 1 or 2 emails a week from parents just asking for advice, and either I refer them to something on our website, or I'll write back and say, tell me a little bit more. You know, they're always looking for like the yellow brick road and what's going to get my kid to
That's
college.
Definitely not there.
Yeah.
I mean, usually it's not there. But one of the things that I know that I also learned going through college that I feel like isn't usually kind of touted as an option, but is for autistic people, is auditing classes. When I realized that auditing a class was an option, that made such a huge difference for me, because I was able to like get the exposure more than once. So because a lot of autistic people also have kind of like slower processing, not everyone, some of them, like my kid is like super fast at processing, but I'm more of a slow processor. So having the option to kind of audit a class helps you with that transition too, where you're getting some exposure to it before there's any stakes involved. Is there like, I don't know if there's like standard policy on like informing people of that as an option. Is that something that's more like hush hush and like, understood but not spoken about? Because I had to figure that out on my own, and I don't know if colleges even advertise that as an option.
Well, some of the disability services professionals know that and will. It's pretty specific to the person and the institution. So when a student with any kind of learning difference, whether it's ADHD or dyslexia or autism, comes to college, they are typically bringing with them a kind of some historical documents, and like the IEP. Now, the IEP doesn't follow them to college. It's not what the college uses to determine what they're going to provide in terms of accommodations, but it gives the professional a whole lot of information. And then that information becomes part of the interactive process where a disability services professional sits down with a student and says, tell me everything you can about like what works for you. What are some of the challenges? What strategies have you learned? And then they begin to kind of build a accommodation portfolio. And some of them will say, we can, a reduced class course load is an accommodation. So most of your classmates are going to take 5 classes. Let's have you start with 3 and see how that goes. And, and at that point, a student can certainly say, I want to take more. Well, what if we did this one as an audit? And, you really want to take this class, but you're not sure, the student's saying, I want to be pre-med. Okay, but, my grades in high school in the sciences were B's and C's. Okay, we can put you in Bio 101, but you might fail it. And if you fail it, it is going to follow you. Like that grade is going to follow you the rest of your career, and you're going to be digging out of a hole. So what about auditing for a semester? And so some people will make that suggestion, and other times the student or the parents might make a suggestion, and the college professional will say, we can try that. Now, there are some implications with financial aid, because financial aid and sometimes like on-campus housing, those things are tied to a student being enrolled full-time. And that's where there has to be some advocacy maybe on the part of the family, because not every disability services professional knows that they have legally the opportunity to allow a student to be part-time and maintain their financial aid or maintain their housing. But they will sometimes scare students into staying full-time because they're like, well, it's probably going to affect your aid. And it will. I mean, it will reduce your aid if you're only paying for 3 classes instead of 5. But most colleges, whether, are going to have like one amount that you pay for tuition. And so if you go from full-time to part-time, that cost is going to be reduced. And so you need less aid. But I think some parents get really spooked by, and then he's not going to graduate in 4 years. Well, who cares, right? Like, who cares? As long as they're having a good experience and learning things, 4 years is just, it's a social construct.
Yeah, I think I graduated in like 4.5, I think.
Yeah.
So one of the things that kind of is not spoken about much, and I don't really know how much can be done or how much it is discussed, but autism is also a social disability, and part of the problem, at least like in my experience going to college, was you don't really have that awareness on campus. Like you might with maybe like say what you're doing, you're aware of this, but it doesn't necessarily trickle down to the professors, the students. And so sometimes it might feel to the autistic individual that they feel like they're kind of like in a non affirming environment where they might be judged for maybe requesting certain accommodations or for perhaps feeling like they're behind. Like I know, like for me, in one of my classes, I was a pre-med that ended up switching. I did really well in high school, but college was another animal. And I basically felt so awkward and embarrassed for not being able to process at the rate of my peers that when my professor kept trying to explain things to me, I would just lie and say that I understood just so he would stop asking me, because I was like so embarrassed that I was the only one not getting it. And I eventually dropped that course. So I was just like wondering, like culturally, from like kind of more of like a cultural perspective,
Yeah.
what is it, if anything, is there any sort of like awareness initiatives or anything being done by CAN on the professional side of things? Because I know like on the student side of things, there's always these like advocate groups or clubs or associations or organizations, but has that caught up on like the more professional side of things? Is the professional side looking more at some of that like social side or social experience part of it too?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So what year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated early in 2016, or sorry,
Okay.
2006.
2006.
Yeah,
So,
high school.
so 18, 19 years ago. I think that if you were to start college today, you would find a very different landscape. I think you'd find a lot more awareness of neurodiversity. And that's writ large, right? Like, so autism, but ADHD, OCD, the idea that people learn differently. And this isn't a radical idea, right? Because, we've known that learning styles are different in students, and some students do really well in lecture classes and some need hands-on learning. We know that Universal Design for Learning, UDL, is really the gold standard for how classes should be designed to accommodate all learners. And, UDL in the classroom is like the idea of curb cuts on a physical campus, right? Like you put curb cuts in so that people who use wheelchairs can get up and down the sidewalks, but you also benefit the people who are, who have trouble walking, who are pushing a stroller, who are using crutches, the elderly on walker, like all these people benefit from these curb cuts that were there for the wheelchair users. And that's kind of how UDL is, like designed a class with multiple means of representation, multiple means of evaluation. And you not only serve the students who have the formal diagnoses of learning differences, you serve the kids who've not ever been diagnosed, but have really been struggling all along. And suddenly they're like just kicking it, it's like, oh my gosh, I am smart. I am smart. I can learn. And so I think that landscape is really changing on college campuses. I think there's been a lot of, centers for teaching and learning that teach faculty about UDL. I think there are, these 140 programs. That's like, we've doubled the number of programs on campuses in the last 5 or 6 years. I think disability services professionals are very invested in better understanding neurodiversity as one of the disability categories that they're responsible to work with. And so they're doing training with faculty and staff. And then I think the students are coming from high schools where neurodiversity has been accepted and understood, and they're much more open to it, like, like, okay with the weird quirky kid, right? Because yeah, I had weird quirky friends in high school.
From my age.
Yeah, but I think that changes every year. And so, we get approached pretty often from students who want to start neurodiversity alliances on their campus. And so, we direct them to an organization that we partner with that does exactly that, like helps these groups get started. We get a lot of requests for faculty and staff training. We have a speakers bureau called the Consultants Collective, and they do webinars for, a whole campus, or they visit a campus, they consult with a campus, or do it for like an association. I did one for the Northwest Association of Title IX administrators, right? And Title IX and student conduct are huge issues with neurodiversity that we don't have time to get into, but like really, really critical. And so people are learning. And at the far end of the college experience, right, there are these employers who have neurodiversity hiring initiatives, like some of the big financial and technology firms, Microsoft and Google and Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase, and they're actually looking for neurodivergent talent. So it's in the best interest of these colleges to help these students be successful, get them out the door into meaningful jobs, and everybody wins.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I have a few minutes here, but I want to ask you two more questions. The first one is, this is primarily a audience of parents of autistic kids. So if there was like one piece of advice that you could give, just briefly, what would that piece of advice be to these parents who might eventually be sending their kids off to college?
Oh, one piece of advice I think would be to join CAN. We have a $99 family membership, and it gives you access to our database of autism support programs, access to a lot of webinars, and access to our consultants. And I think that just educating yourself about the college landscape is going to be critical. I think that that survey that I mentioned that we did with program directors, we turned that into something called a college readiness checklist. And that's a free PDF. And if you go to college-ready.com, you can download that. And it's a great source it's kind of a framework for a conversation a family should have about college. And you should look at this when they're freshmen or sophomores in college and really start thinking about it. And we turned that into this workbook, which is also available on that website. And you can get an ebook or a hard copy. Like, this has to be a family discussion about readiness. And, if we can go upstream to where parents and students are thinking about college and really help them understand and demystify this very complicated higher ed landscape, then they're going to make better choices. And those better choices are going to lead those students to have better experiences when they get there. And like, that to me is absolutely what we're trying to do. We're teaching,
starting the conversation.
Yeah, starting the conversation in those parents, and then meanwhile, we're working with the college professionals to be better prepared to be on the receiving end of that journey, right? So you get the parents like figuring out like, okay, sort of metaphorically, like, what do we need to pack? What exercises do you need to do to be really ready for this? And like, they're doing all that. And the college professionals are like, what do we need to do to give these students their best shot at success? And that's, what we do with CAN is like, we align these pipelines. And if we do our job well, students have a much better chance. Not a guarantee, but no students are guaranteed to be successful.
Absolutely.
The neurotypical ones struggle as well, but this is going to improve their chances significantly.
Awesome. So I have one more question for you. I ask everybody who comes on the podcast this one question. Our podcast is called Embracing Autism. So what does embracing autism mean to you?
I think it means just what I said. It's preparing our campuses to be fully invested in and fully supportive of neurodivergent and autistic students, and recognizing that like this is not charity work, right? Like neurodiversity exists on our campuses, and if we can embrace the idea of neurodiversity, we learn better. Like, I always think that it's the autistic students, if we can give them the academic tools they need, that's who's going to cure cancer, right? Like, that's that way of thinking really differently about a problem really benefits us all. And so for me, embracing autism is just acknowledging that, yeah, brains are wired differently for a reason. And we are a better community, a better learning environment when we don't marginalize certain types of brains. Instead,
Well said.
put them center to what we do.
I like that. So thank you so much. Really quickly here, where can our listeners learn more about your work and where can they stay connected with the College Autism Network?
Well, the easiest way is our website, which is collegeautismnetwork.org. And so we are, really happy to have people find us there. The website I mentioned, college-ready.com, is where you'll find our PDF checklist, readiness checklist, and our books. And that also gets you to something called Inclusive Academia, which I didn't mention, but Inclusive Academia is a YouTube channel where we have interviews with a lot of these program directors and with students in these programs. And it's a great way to kind of get a sense of what these programs and services on campuses are like. So I think those three things, collegeautismnetwork.org, college-ready.com, and Inclusive Academia on YouTube. And if you could do some of those, your research there, you will learn a lot.
And I think for anybody who might be listening who does the whole social media thing, they also have Facebook at College Autism and Instagram at College Autism Network for anybody who follows there. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciated the conversation, Lee. I hope that you had fun. I did.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. It was a lot of fun talking to you. And I so appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.